Time for a look back at February Tynwald, and as ever with these things, February Tynwald was as much of interest as to what wasn't being said as to what was. Certainly what was being said was that we have a new budget for 24-25 year, and remarkably, for the first time in a very long time, 6 members of the House of Keys voted against the budget and spoke against certain provisions, not least the increasing of the higher rate of tax and the freezing of tax allowances. But when it came to the vote on these specific measures, the members speaking against and voting against the budget seemed to change their minds and support them. And no doubt they had their reasons for doing that. But of course, what was brewing and now becomes more obvious as to why certain people were behaving in certain ways was the departure. Apparently we're not to call it a sacking, it's the a strategic review or some such thing of Council of Ministers, and the removal effectively of the Minister for Education, Sport and Culture, Ms Edge, Julie Edge, and her replacement with Daphne Kane. And of course Daphne had a question number 22 in relation to asking the Minister if she would publish the review of school buildings and the wider Department of Education, Sport and Culture estate and provide a statement on what action her department proposes to take as a result. For those who care to listen again, you'll notice that Mrs. Kane didn't ask a load of supplementary questions, and possibly the reason for that was by the time she was asking these questions, which was, I think it was on Wednesday morning, she already knew that she was to replace the Minister for Education, Sport and Culture. Indeed, on that Wednesday, I could sort of tell there was something going on. Daphne Kane certainly looked like the cat who'd got the cream, and I kept asking her, was there anything she wanted to tell me? Did she want to talk to me about anything? And she was very professional and didn't spill any beans. So that in itself is a big story, but of course the biggest story was the reaction to the budget. Surprised really that government didn't see this coming. The government seems to have sort of lashed out a bit, I think possibly at me and some others, for daring to suggest this was a high tax and high spend budget, and perhaps I should have said higher tax, high spend budget, because there are jurisdictions around the world, countries around the world, where tax is higher, indeed much higher than the Isle of Man, but the Council of Ministers didn't seem to see this coming, that there would be quite such a reaction to the budget. Certainly the Chamber of Commerce have undertaken a survey. As I'm recording this, I'm told that it's quite not inflammatory, but damning, I think, in relation to the budget. Certainly when we did our budget programme on Friday dinner time, a member of the Chamber of Commerce was there and showing the results as they were coming into a poll of chamber members, which very clearly showed that they were not best pleased with the budget. And yet there are some really good things in that budget. I have to ask the question, who in Council of Ministers was asking, how is this budget going to be perceived, and how can we present it in such a way that more of the good stuff would hit the headlines? And I feel that they didn't particularly succeed with that, and then seemed quite keen to lay into the media for reporting both what people were saying and indeed what ministers were saying, and the obvious conclusions that people reached when they read the actual budget. But the good news is, of course, if you are a pensioner, if you are on certain benefits, certainly if you are in receipt of child benefit, and particularly if you have more than one child, then you are going to be better off as a result of this budget. But we can't help but make comparisons with where we used to be and where we are now in relation to our tax situation, personal tax situation with the UK. And it is fair to say that it is surprising that in the Isle of Man, if you are on the minimum wage and earning or working for, I think it's more than 39 hours, but it might be more than 40 hours a week, you will be paying the higher rate of tax. That seems extraordinary, and seems like the kind of headline that would be an obvious one that people would look at. And perhaps had the tax cap been raised slightly, maybe people would have been less concerned at the changes or lack of changes in terms of allowances that happened in relation to tax. I mean, the other really good news story is if you happen to work in the health service or indeed happen to need the services of the health service, in as much as a substantial uplift in the health services budget has been given, it's still tens of millions short of where Sir Jonathan Michaels, who did the report which resulted in the creation of Manx Care, felt that the budget needed to be. But it's at least a significant portion of the difference has been met by this year's budget. And again, similarly with the Department of Education, not quite as big an increase, but an £18 million increase for the Department of Education. And that is good news, particularly for the many teachers who perhaps are struggling, particularly in relation to children with additional educational needs, and what appears to be a significant increase in the need in that area, for which a budget formally hadn't been available. I'm not absolutely clear where all of the £18 million that's been granted to the Department of Education. I'm not absolutely sure where all that goes, but I'm hoping at least that some of that is going into additional educational needs. There were, though, other items on the Tynwald order paper, and budget. You make your own mind up. Certainly, you can read the budget, and there's loads of really good, useful commentary on the budget available. But you can certainly read that if you go to the government website and look up the budget. But other items that appeared on the order paper included a statement by the Chief Minister into the review of the government's management of the Ranson case and the report to Tynwald by Richard Wright KC. It was fair to say that the Chief Minister basically said that this will be debated at a future Tynwald, but he was putting on record certain things to make sure that this didn't get overlooked. The Manx Development Corporation, Dr. Allinson, gave a personal statement because effectively he had said one thing and had been very adamant about that particular thing in relation to the ability for the Manx Development Corporation to draw down funds. And subsequently he discovered what the people asking him the question, I suspect, already knew, that actually the Manx Development Corporation had the ability to draw down, I think it was up to £100 million. Then there was the supplementary vote, which of course has been significantly trailed and understood by the media in advance of the Tynwald sitting. This was the additional monies, 8.9 million to Department of Education, 30 million to the Department of Health and Social Care, 2.2 million to Home Affairs and 5.6 to the Department of Infrastructure. There were also some... Tynwald was requested to authorise the Treasury to expend from Capital Financing Reserve in respect of the year ended 31st of March, 2.859355 million additional capital in respect of excess expenditure incurred by the Department of Health and Social Care, and also £159,069 to M&H. Now, these tend to be more related to not so much overspends as over delivery, in as much as things have been delivered which were perhaps due to be spent in next year's budget, but they were delivered in this year's. Then we had the Manx Utilities annual plan, which certainly looked as though it had kind of been cobbled together with the Manx Utilities formal plan that it needs to produce as a for the General Registry. It did seem as though there were two similar-ish plans, and some of the cobbling together didn't quite seem to read right, but certainly the chair of the MUA gave a sterling defence of his document. The Standing Committee of Tynwald on Public Accounts first report for the session 23-24 Isle of Man Ferry Terminal project was moved by Mr. Speaker. And of course this was the report which found some fairly interesting findings in relation to what has gone wrong with the proposal to build a ferry terminal in Liverpool. It's I'm not sure we've got all the answers here, but it does seem to indicate that there were some steps that seemed to be suggested early days that weren't followed, and as a result, maybe things got a little bit more expensive than that perhaps they might have been. Then Tynwald reaffirmed the appointments of various people to the statutory boards of Tynwald, and the Manx Heritage Foundation, or Culture Vannon as we know it, which of course is not a statutory board as such. I think it's a committee of Tynwald, but maybe that's changed in recent years. Then there was the appointment of Cabinet Office non-executive directors. Chris Hall, formerly of Manx Telecom, and Guy Templar, and apologies, Guy, if you're listening, I'm not quite sure where Guy had formerly been, but they are appointed as non-executive directors for the Cabinet Office for a term of 3 years. I think the belief is that having non-executive directors will be useful in helping ministers to run their areas of government in a more productive manner, although perhaps knowledge of politics might be useful as well in these areas. And then there was an attempt, and this probably showed some of the discussion that was going on behind the scenes, an attempt by the chair of the Economic Policy Review Committee to appoint an alternate member to John Wallenberg. John Wallenberg, of course, is chair of the MUA, and it was felt by the committee that maybe in relation to certain investigations in relation to the economic strategy, it would be inappropriate for John Wallenberg, as chair of the MUA, to sit on that committee. John Wallenberg was quite diplomatic in his contribution, in saying that, well, he understood the position of the committee, but he didn't necessarily see any problem if Tynwald felt that it was okay for him to continue, basically to continue in that role. And after various moves, including a move to unseat Mrs. Christian as chair of that committee, it was resolved that things could be left as they were. There was a vote then on the Energy Strategy Board and policy, and this seemed to be effectively a kind of a spat, perhaps, maybe a misunderstanding between Mr. Thomas and Mrs. Barber, the DEFA minister. Basically, the DEFA minister had overlooked the issue of the Isle of Man government's energy strategy actually being laid before Tynwald and debated in Tynwald. That was the way she put it. Mr. Thomas saw it differently. Then the replacement for Castle Rushen High School motion wasn't moved because I guess the Speaker felt that progress was being made. And then we moved on to the orders. And of course, as I already said, the budget was on a separate order paper. Sadly, I missed one day of Tynwald because I was a little under the weather, so I can't report on the questions particularly well because I wasn't there for them all. But yeah, a lively Tynwald in terms of what we heard, but a much more lively Tynwald full of intrigue and skullduggery behind the scenes, which sadly we weren't in a position to broadcast live on Manx Radio. So that was your February Tynwald.
Thank you for making it to the end of the Little Manx Radio newscast. You are obviously someone with exquisite taste. May I politely suggest you might want to subscribe to this and a wide range of Manx Radio podcasts at your favourite podcast provider so our best bits will magically appear on your smartphone. Thank you.